Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast, or shall we say the Bundesliga video. This is an emergency video, Stefan. He's Stefan Bienkowski. I'm Manu, of course. Stefan, Jude Bellingham. There has been a storm of flurry of reports that Real Madrid are now circling in on the soon-to-be 20-year-old English Borussia Dortmund midfielder. I mean, I always thought that Real Madrid was the most likely end game here. But we have to put a caveat on all of this. Marco reporting this first, Fabrizio Romano then confirming it, as he often does. The one report that I would want to pay the most attention to is Patrick Berger from Sport 1, who is very much tuned in at what's going on at Borussia Dortmund. And he's also saying that the Bellingham camp has come to terms with Real Madrid, underlining, though, that there has been no negotiations between Real and Borussia Dortmund at the moment. And he further adds that Man City and Liverpool are out. Stefan, I mean, this has been such a flurry of reports, and I think it took some people by quite some surprise. And I think it took some people to actually wait almost 24 hours to kind of dig into this. The Athletic coming on with a big report today. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's certainly quite interesting. The timing of it's also quite interesting, considering we're just a few weeks away from Dortmund potentially clinching their first league title in 10 years. So I'd be very surprised if this is coming out of Jude Bellingham's camp. Can't imagine that he's kind of wants any of this kind of excess kind of media attention right now in the wrong way, or certainly doesn't want fans to think that he's already kind of eyeing up his next move next season. But, you know, we always knew that Real Madrid were one of the kind of main contenders. We always thought it was Real Madrid, Manchester City, Liverpool, maybe Manchester United, but they seem to have gone in a different direction. And, you know, the Marca story was really interesting. As you said, Berger Sport Island is probably far more reliable in this because I was reading today that Marca the story, they reported the story that, you know, Bellingham had agreed personal terms. But already by this morning on Friday, they had a story on the front page saying Real Madrid deny that they've made personal terms, and they'd actually watered down their original report, which I think started by saying, you know, Real Madrid have agreed terms with Dortmund, which was then watered down to Real Madrid have agreed terms with Bellingham, which has now been watered down to Real Madrid deny that they've agreed terms with Bellingham. But of course, you know, Sport Eyes have said, as you mentioned, that Liverpool pulled out and Manchester City are in pole position. Now, the Athletic story is very interesting here, I think, because they've kind of pushed back on this to the extent saying, you know, their sources have suggested that Real Madrid's probably kind of in line with the way Marca have maybe realigned their story and said that, you know, nothing's been set in stone yet. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing is that the crucial line in that whole story, actually, which we can only encourage people to go read and subscribe to these media outlets. They're fantastic. I'm not trying to just cherry pick the best bits so people have to subscribe by any means. But the interesting thing stood out to me, and it was that according to the Athletic, Real Madrid, you know, are desperate to sign Bellingham, but they're also not willing to get into a bidding war with the Premier League clubs for him. And they're not really willing to go over 100 million euros for the player, which is about 50 million short of what Dortmund reportedly want for Bellingham this summer. So it feels a wee bit like a game of chess in the sense that, you know, Real Madrid are ahead in one aspect, but, you know, as I kind of said on a Substack note yesterday, you know, it ain't over until the fat lady at Manchester City sings, you know, with the purse strings, if you want, because, you know, it does kind of feel to me as though this thing could definitely still turn its head, and Manchester City could definitely still come in the 11th hour with an offer which completely blows Real Madrid out of the water. And I think we've got two different kind of tactics here. We've got Real Madrid who are probably trying to, you know, convince the player to join the club and convince the player it's his best move, to which they then rely on the player themselves to kind of then kind of turn to Dortmund and say, hey, look, I want to move to Real Madrid, this makes deal happen. As they did with Tchouaméni at Monaco, which is again something that was in the Athletic report, but I think it's a very succinct parallel there, as opposed to maybe a Manchester City who, like we saw with Erling Haaland, took their time, waited, and they knew that, you know, at the end of the day, they'd be able to offer more money than any other club, and perhaps offer a more enticing sporting project. So I don't know. We have kind of been here before with the Erling Haaland situation, and there's just something in the back of my mind that makes me think we still can't rule Manchester City out yet.
Yeah, I think the difference maybe with Erling Haaland was that there was actually an emotional connection to Manchester City through his father, right? And I think that did play a very important role here. I think too that Real Madrid seemed to be almost a better fit in many ways for Jude Bellingham, and also the sort of personality and maybe the brand that he tries to cultivate, right? There has been he would be the 6th English player to play at Real Madrid. Real Madrid still have this aura of being the original super club, right? The OG super club that also still actually acts like a super club by winning the biggest titles year in and year out. You're virtually guaranteed a Champions League title every year with Real Madrid, which is not something that any other club in the world can say. And look, they might beat Man City in the semi-final this year as well and clinch yet another Champions League title, despite doing quite poorly in the league. And I think that is something that is really, really enticing here for a player like Bellingham. I also think that the timeline kind of fits, right? Toni Kroos has renewed. Luka Modric is still there too, but they're in their 30s. Kroos is 33 now, right? Modric is 37. There seems to be, he makes sense as an almost natural succession. The one thing that I think doesn't really make 100% sense yet, and maybe it will make sense when the dust settles on this, the timeline of him moving this summer to Real Madrid isn't quite right in my mind. And I think this is maybe something that you can, when you as the story develops, and you have to also remember the special relationship that Hans-Joachim Watzke, the CEO of Borussia Dortmund, has with Real Madrid, right? You almost wonder, maybe Dortmund would be actually willing to take less to keep him for one more year. And I think that is actually something that Real Madrid would be willing to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interesting thing there as well is that, and again, this is kind of always been reported, that if Real Madrid aren't really willing to go over 100 million euros for Bellingham, then it does kind of suggest that maybe they're also thinking, well, if we wait till next summer, if we convince the player that he wants to move to Real Madrid, we can just kind of hold off and wait until his contract runs down to the point that, Dortmund would be willing to accept 100 million euros. So that maybe does kind of line up with the idea that he does stay around for another season. It's maybe in Bellingham's best interest to wait and see what happens at Real Madrid, because you're absolutely right in the sense that they're losing Kroos or losing Modric at some point, but there's still not really any confirmation as to, out of those players we mentioned, Tchouaméni, Camavinga and Valverde, there's still no kind of confirmation who's slotted in where long term. So it might suit Bellingham to wait another year and say, well, I'm going to wait and see how the kind of, things fall here, and then just kind of wait and see who the confirmed trio are. Equally, at Manchester City, and I think this is something that's maybe worth keeping an eye on, which may be like a domino that leads to more dominoes falling and leading to Man City making a bid for Bellingham, is the contract situation for Bernardo Silva and Ilkay Gundogan at both Manchester City. Gundogan in particular, I think, is probably the player that Bellingham would replace in our squad. So there's a lot of talk as to whether he signs a new contract, whether he moves on to Barcelona. So almost like a full circle here, perhaps. But I think if Gundogan was to stay at Man City, signing a 1-year deal, that maybe suggests that they're not going all in for like a big box-to-box midfielder this summer. But equally, if he decides he wants to move and Barcelona come calling, then maybe that's a kind of sign that Man City are ready to kind of, loosen their purse strings and make a bid for Bellingham this summer. But we still don't really know what's happening. We're just kind of reading the tea leaves at this moment. But it feels like we are kind of slowly getting closer and closer to a resolution with this one.
Maybe the one thing that I want to add before we wrap this up, you can also take an offer like the one that Real Madrid has just agreed with, quote unquote, with Bellingham, and take that to Borussia Dortmund and say, match it. So, that is the one thing that you also have to keep in mind here. Mark Bellingham, Jude Bellingham's father, could very well just also do that and then see how Borussia Dortmund react to it. And then Borussia Dortmund might say, well, we're saving 5 million on Reus, we're saving 5 million on Hummels, Torgen Hazard is off the books. Okay. That is also something to keep in mind here, as this develops.
Yeah, I mean, we should point out, just before we finish up, just leading up, most of the kind of news stories coming out of Dortmund up until this week, where the Bellingham was actually quite interested in signing a new contract.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stories, a lot of kind of good reporting saying that he's quite tempted to kind of, take on a new wage at the club. The club's been putting money aside for him to become like the top earner at the club. There's a lot of kind of suggestions that he was quite happy to do that. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah, let's not suggest that just because one story out of Spain or, Sport Irons have one story to suggest that Bellingham's packed his bags, he's ready to go this summer. There's still so much football left to play, let alone so much business left to do.
Yeah, we can continue speculating. That's the great part about this. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll be back with more gegenpressing content soon. And until then, auf Wiedersehen.